The dredging crew working near Greenville, Mississippi in 1921 pulled up something that stopped their work for 3 days. Tangled in their equipment, human bones, rusted chains, and a leather medical case with surgical tools still arranged in perfect order. The coroner's report identified remains from at least 47 individuals. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. In the spring of 1881, rivermen working the Mississippi between Memphis and Vicksburg began reporting an unusual sight. A collection of barges and flatboats had lashed themselves together, creating what appeared to be a floating village. The vessels moved as a single unit, drifting downstream with the current during daylight hours and anchoring in quiet eddies after dark. Local pilots called it the shanty fleet, and within weeks, it became a fixture along that stretch of the river. The settlement consisted of roughly 15 vessels of varying sizes. The largest barge, painted a faded red and measuring nearly 60 feet in length, served as the central structure. Smaller flatboats and houseboats clustered around it like satellites. Wooden walkways connected the vessels, creating a network of passages between the floating structures. Lanterns hung from poles after sunset, giving the entire assembly an almost festive appearance when viewed from shore. Approximately 40 women lived aboard the fleet. Most were in their 20s and 30s, though some appeared younger. They wore colorful dresses that stood out against the gray-brown river water, and they could be seen hanging laundry, cooking over small stoves, and moving between the vessels. When the fleet anchored near established towns, some of the women would go ashore to purchase supplies. They paid in cash and kept their business brief. The fleet's purpose became apparent quickly. This was a mobile brothel, operating in the jurisdictional gray area of the Mississippi River. No single county could claim authority over the water itself, and the women moved frequently enough to avoid any sustained legal action. They distributed handbills in river towns, advertising entertainment, gambling, and companionship. The messages were carefully worded to avoid explicit statements, but their meaning was clear. Men began visiting the fleet regularly. Farmers from nearby counties would ride to the river when word spread that the settlement had anchored nearby. Riverboat workers would row out during their time between shifts. Some visitors stayed for an evening and returned to shore. Others remained aboard for days, taking advantage of the whiskey, card games, and female company the fleet provided. The operation followed a predictable calendar. The women knew which towns had harvest festivals, which ports saw the most river traffic, and when laborers received their wages. The fleet would position itself accordingly, arriving at locations when men had money and time. Local authorities occasionally grumbled about the moral implications, but most adopted a practical stance. The women paid docking fees when they anchored near town wharves, and the men who visited did so of their own free will. By autumn of 1881, the fleet had become an established part of the river's economy. The women seemed organized and businesslike in their operations. They maintained their vessels well, kept supplies stocked, and avoided causing trouble in the towns where they purchased goods. To observers on shore, it appeared to be exactly what it claimed: a floating house of ill repute that had found a way to operate beyond the reach of moral reformers and legal restrictions. But passenger manifests at downstream ports began showing something curious. The number of men arriving at places like Vicksburg and Natchez didn't match the number who should have disembarked based on river traffic patterns. Some men were boarding vessels upriver and never reaching their intended destinations. The discrepancy was small at first, just a handful of missing names over several months. Not enough to draw attention. Not yet. The women of the shanty fleet operated with surprising sophistication. Their recruitment system for customers relied on careful planning and an understanding of human nature that would have impressed legitimate business people of the era. Every aspect of their operation had been designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk. The handbills they distributed followed a specific formula. Printed on cheap paper in Memphis or St. Louis, the advertisements promised entertainment and hospitality on the Mississippi, with phrases like refined company and discreet accommodation. The wording skirted legal definitions of solicitation while making the offerings unmistakable to anyone reading between the lines. The women would hire local boys to distribute these handbills in saloons, general stores, and boarding houses throughout river towns. Each woman aboard the fleet had a specific role. Some served as greeters, meeting potential customers at the dock and explaining the services available. Others managed the gambling operations, running card games and dice in the smaller barges. A few handled the practical matters of cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the vessels. The eldest among them, a woman named Adelaide Crow, managed the finances and kept detailed records of income and expenses in leather-bound ledgers. The fleet maintained a calendar that reflected months of observation and planning. They knew that Clarksdale saw an influx of cotton buyers in September. Helena attracted lumber workers in March when the spring timber drives began. Greenville hosted a harvest festival in October that drew farmers from 3 counties. The women positioned their floating settlement to intercept men when they had cash in their pockets and time to spend it. Prices for services were clearly established. An evening's entertainment cost between $3 and $10, depending on what a customer requested. Whiskey sold for 25 cents a glass. Card games operated with house minimums that ensured profit regardless of who won individual hands. The women accepted payment in cash, trade goods, or occasionally promissory notes from men they judged creditworthy. The business model appeared straightforward and, within the moral standards of frontier commerce, relatively honest. Men knew what they were paying for. The women delivered the promised services. The transactions occurred between willing participants. This veneer of legitimacy helped the fleet avoid serious legal challenges during its first year of operation. But certain customers received special attention. Men who arrived alone, without companions who might notice their absence, were particularly valued. Travelers passing through the region with no local connections found themselves warmly welcomed. Drifters, seasonal workers, and men who mentioned estrangement from their families received invitations to stay longer, often with discounted rates on accommodations. The women developed techniques for identifying these vulnerable targets. They would engage customers in conversation, asking seemingly innocent questions about their destinations, their families, and their plans. A man who mentioned he was traveling to California to start fresh became a person of interest. Someone who admitted he had no one waiting for him back home warranted special consideration. The women shared this intelligence with Adelaide Crow, who maintained a separate set of notes about particular customers. For most visitors, the experience remained exactly what they expected. They would arrive in the evening, enjoy the entertainment and companionship, and depart the next morning with nothing more than lighter pockets and perhaps some guilt. These ordinary transactions provided the fleet's public face and allowed the operation to continue without drawing suspicion. The gambling operations proved particularly effective at extending visits. Men who lost money at cards often stayed longer, hoping to win back their losses. The house games were subtly manipulated to encourage this behavior without being obviously fraudulent. A man might win a hand or two, just enough to keep him playing, but the overall odds ensured the fleet profited consistently. Whiskey flowed freely, sold at prices that made it accessible. The alcohol served multiple purposes. It loosened inhibitions and opened wallets. It made men more talkative, revealing information about themselves they might otherwise keep private. And it made them more susceptible to suggestion about staying another night or trying one more hand of cards. By winter of 1881, the shanty fleet had established itself as a permanent, if mobile, fixture along the middle Mississippi. Rivermen knew its schedule. Town merchants sold supplies to the women regularly. Local authorities had settled into an uneasy acceptance of its presence. The operation seemed stable, profitable, and sustainable. What no one on shore understood was that the fleet's true business model had nothing to do with vice. The entertainment, gambling, and companionship were merely the bait. The real profits came from an entirely different source, one that required the women to identify men who would not be missed, men who could disappear without triggering serious investigation. The carefully cultivated intelligence about isolated travelers and estranged family members served a purpose far darker than simple customer service. The fleet was not just selling pleasure, it was selecting victims. The first formal missing person report connected to the shanty fleet was filed in December of 1881. A woman named Martha Hensley walked into the sheriff's office in Helena, Arkansas, asking about her husband. Thomas Hensley had left their farm 3 weeks earlier, saying he would visit the floating settlement for an evening and return by morning. He never came home. Sheriff Edgar Pruitt took down the information with little enthusiasm. Men disappeared on the frontier regularly, often by choice. Hensley could have decided to abandon his farm and his wife. He might have fallen into the river drunk. Perhaps he had simply kept moving downriver, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Pruitt promised to make inquiries, but held out little hope. When the sheriff rode out to the fleet 2 days later, he found the women cooperative and seemingly confused. Adelaide Crowe consulted her records and confirmed that a Thomas Hensley had visited on the date in question. He had stayed for several hours, paid for whiskey and companionship, and left the fleet around midnight. Several women remembered him. He had mentioned going to St. Louis to look for work. They assumed he had caught a ride on a passing steamboat. Pruitt returned to shore with this explanation and delivered it to Martha Hensley. She insisted her husband would never leave without telling her, would never abandon their farm. The sheriff noted her objections, but took no further action. Men left their wives. It happened. Without evidence of foul play, there was nothing to investigate. By March of 1882, similar reports had been filed in 5 counties along the river. A son who never returned from a trip to Greenville. A brother last seen rowing out to the fleet near Rosedale. A husband who vanished after visiting the floating settlement at Lake Providence. Each case followed the same pattern. The man had gone to the fleet voluntarily. The women remembered him and provided reasonable explanations for his departure. No bodies were found. Evidence of violence existed. Local sheriffs faced practical obstacles that made investigation nearly impossible. The fleet moved constantly, crossing county and state lines with ease. A sheriff in Mississippi had no authority to pursue inquiries in Arkansas. Coordinating between jurisdictions required time and resources that rural law enforcement simply didn't have. The women, when questioned, always cooperated politely and provided plausible accounts. Their stories held together because they had been carefully prepared. Some families refused to accept the official explanations. They hired private investigators, or traveled to multiple river towns asking questions. These efforts revealed the pattern more clearly. At least 23 men had disappeared after visiting the shanty fleet over a 14-month period. All were traveling alone. None had been seen again at any downstream port. Their bodies had not washed up on riverbanks. They had simply ceased to exist. The families began comparing notes. A gathering in Memphis during April of 1882 brought together 12 relatives of missing men. They shared their stories and realized they were describing nearly identical circumstances. Each man had visited the fleet. Each had been alone. Each had told someone he would return within a day or two. None had. This group petitioned the governor of Tennessee, arguing that the disappearances constituted a clear pattern requiring official investigation. The governor's office responded with bureaucratic caution. The incidents occurred across multiple states. Most of the missing men were adults who had left home voluntarily. Without bodies or witnesses to crimes, there was insufficient evidence to justify a major law enforcement operation. The river itself presented another challenge. The Mississippi in that era was a graveyard. People drowned regularly. Bodies caught in currents or snagged on submerged logs might never surface. If someone wanted to dispose of remains, the river offered endless opportunities. Its depth, its sediment, and its powerful flow could hide evidence indefinitely. By autumn of 1882, the count of missing men had reached 37. Newspaper editors in river towns began publishing occasional articles about the disappearances, though they framed the stories carefully. The headlines spoke of mysterious vanishings and river tragedies rather than accusing the fleet directly. Libel laws protected the women from explicit allegations without proof. The shanty fleet continued operating. Adelaide Crowe and her companions maintained their business with apparent confidence. They still distributed handbills, still welcomed customers, still paid for supplies in cash. If they worried about the growing number of families asking questions, they showed no sign of it. What the families didn't know, what even the most suspicious sheriffs couldn't prove, was that the missing men hadn't left the river at all. They remained very close to where they had last been seen alive. The weighted bodies rested on the river bottom, sometimes directly beneath the spots where the fleet commonly anchored. Chains held them down. Mud and sediment gradually covered them. The Mississippi kept its secrets, and the women aboard the fleet understood exactly how to use the river's natural processes to hide their crimes. The disappearances continued through the winter. More reports were filed. More families searched for answers. The pattern grew more obvious, but without physical evidence, authorities remained unable or unwilling to act. The fleet drifted on, selecting new victims, and the river accepted what it was given. In the spring of 1883, a man carrying 2 leather suitcases boarded the shanty fleet near Memphis. Dr. Leland Guthrie was 43 years old, thin-faced, and spoke with the careful diction of someone who had received formal education. The women recognized immediately that he was different from their usual visitors. Guthrie had been a licensed physician in Memphis until the previous autumn. The Tennessee Medical Board had revoked his credentials after investigating complaints about unauthorized procedures performed in his private clinic. The specific details of those complaints remained sealed in court records, but the decision was final. Guthrie could no longer legally practice medicine in the state. Adelaide Crowe met with him privately in the main barge that first evening. Their conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. What passed between them was never recorded, but the outcome became apparent within days. Guthrie would join the fleet permanently. He would receive accommodations, meals, and a percentage of profits from an enterprise that Adelaide had been considering for months. The doctor brought specialized equipment. His suitcases contained surgical instruments, bottles of carbolic acid for sterilization, and medical texts with detailed anatomical illustrations. Over the following week, he made requests for additional supplies. The women purchased these items in Memphis: glass preservation jars, rubber tubing, canvas sheeting, and several gallons of grain alcohol. Guthrie established what he called his medical suite in the hold of the largest barge. The space measured roughly 12 feet by 20 feet and sat below the waterline. He covered the walls with canvas to create a cleanable surface. A table, reinforced and fitted with leather restraints, occupied the center of the room. Shelves along one wall held his instruments and supplies. Oil lamps provided illumination. The transformation of the fleet's operation began immediately. Adelaide's careful selection of isolated victims now served a specific purpose beyond simply choosing people who wouldn't be missed. Guthrie needed subjects for his work, and the fleet's established methods for luring vulnerable men provided exactly what he required. The doctor explained his vision to the women in a meeting held after the suite was completed. Medical schools throughout the South faced a constant shortage of anatomical specimens for teaching. Private physicians conducting experimental procedures needed access to organs and tissue. The law restricted how such materials could be obtained, but the law didn't reach the middle of the Mississippi River. Guthrie proposed a systematic operation. The fleet would continue functioning as it always had, maintaining its public appearance as a floating brothel. But certain customers, those who fit the established profile of isolated travelers, would serve a secondary purpose. Their organs could be harvested, preserved, and sold to medical institutions and private buyers. The bodies, once stripped of valuable tissue, would be weighted and submerged. The financial projections were compelling. A complete set of organs from a single subject could bring $50 to $75 from the right buyers. That exceeded what the fleet typically earned from a week of ordinary business. With proper planning, they could process 2 or 3 subjects per month without drawing additional suspicion. The women listened to this proposal with varying reactions. Some showed immediate enthusiasm for the increased profits. Others expressed concern about the risks. Adelaide made the final decision. The fleet would proceed with Guthrie's plan. The existing disappearances had not triggered serious investigation. Why would a continuation of the same pattern cause problems now? Guthrie established protocols for the operation. Subjects would be sedated using laudanum mixed into whiskey. The dose needed to be carefully calibrated to ensure unconsciousness without causing immediate death. The procedures would be performed at night, when the fleet was anchored in isolated areas, away from other river traffic. The doctor prepared detailed lists of which organs held value and how they should be preserved. Hearts, kidneys, livers, and portions of digestive tissue were most in demand. He purchased additional preservation containers and experimented with different concentrations of alcohol for storage. The specimens needed to remain intact during transport to buyers. Within 2 weeks of Guthrie's arrival, the fleet's true business began. The first subject was a drifter named Samuel Kraft, who had boarded near Helena. He had mentioned traveling west to seek mining opportunities and had no family waiting for him anywhere. He accepted whiskey from one of the women, drank heavily, and eventually lost consciousness. The women carried him to Guthrie's suite. What followed took approximately 4 hours. The doctor worked methodically, removing organs according to his prepared plan. He placed each specimen in a labeled jar, noting the date and basic information about the source. The body, now serving no further purpose, was wrapped in canvas, weighted with chains, and disposed of in the river before dawn. The fleet moved downstream the next morning as planned. Guthrie stored the preserved specimens in a locked cabinet. Within 3 days, a courier boat met the fleet at a predetermined location. The specimens were transferred, payment was collected, and the cycle began again. The operation that Adelaide Crowe had built over 18 months transformed completely. What had been opportunistic murder to hide theft now became systematic harvesting. The Mississippi River, already holding dozens of victims, would receive many more. And Dr. Leland Guthrie, stripped of his medical license but not his knowledge, had found a practice where no regulatory board could reach him. The methodology developed over the summer of 1883 with disturbing efficiency. Dr. Guthrie refined his techniques with each procedure, documenting his improvements in a leather journal he kept locked in his cabin. The fleet's operation evolved into something resembling a legitimate business, complete with schedules, quality controls, and customer service protocols. The selection process became more sophisticated. Adelaide Crowe developed a system for evaluating potential subjects based on multiple factors. Age mattered, because younger men typically had healthier organs that commanded higher prices. Physical condition was assessed through casual observation and conversation. A man who mentioned recent illness or showed signs of heavy drinking was noted as lower priority. The ideal subject was between 25 and 40 years old, in good health, and completely alone in the world. The women learned to gather information without appearing suspicious. They would ask questions framed as friendly interest. Where was he traveling? Did he have family waiting? What kind of work did he do? The answers built a profile that Adelaide would review later. Men who described estrangement from relatives, who were passing through on their way to distant territories, or who admitted to having no permanent home, became marked in her records with a small notation. Not every suitable candidate was selected. The fleet maintained its ordinary business as cover, and most visitors experienced exactly what they expected before departing safely. This selectivity served two purposes. It prevented the disappearance rate from accelerating to a level that might trigger coordinated investigation, and it ensured that the subjects chosen were genuinely unlikely to be missed. Once a subject was identified, the process followed established steps. One of the women would engage him in extended conversation, encouraging him to drink steadily throughout the evening. The whiskey served to him in later hours contained laudanum in carefully measured doses. Guthrie had calculated the amounts needed based on approximate body weight. Too little, and the subject might wake during the procedure. Too much, and death would occur before the organs could be properly harvested. The sedation took effect gradually. The subject would become increasingly drowsy. His speech would slur, and eventually he would lose consciousness. To any observer, he appeared simply drunk. The women would announce that he needed to sleep it off and help him to what was described as a private cabin for recovery. Instead, they brought him to Guthrie's medical suite below deck. The doctor worked through the night on these occasions. His procedures were performed with surgical precision, following the techniques he had learned during his legitimate medical career. He extracted organs systematically, placing each in prepared preservation jars. The work took between 3 and 5 hours, depending on how many specimens he intended to harvest. Guthrie maintained meticulous records of each procedure. His journal entries included dates, descriptions of the subjects, and detailed notes about the condition of harvested organs. He rated each specimen on quality, noting any abnormalities or defects. This documentation served a practical purpose when communicating with buyers about what was available. The preservation process required specific knowledge. Organs needed to be removed quickly after death to prevent deterioration. They were washed in clean water, then submerged in grain alcohol at concentrations Guthrie had determined through experimentation. The jars were sealed with wax to prevent leakage during transport. Labels indicated only the organ type and date, with no information that could identify the source. Disposal of the bodies followed a consistent protocol. They were wrapped in canvas weighted with chains and scrap iron. The fleet would move to a predetermined deep channel location, usually in the hours before dawn. The wrapped remains would be lowered into the water and released. The Mississippi's current and depth ensured they would not surface. The river's bottom geology worked in the fleet's favor. Sediment flowed constantly downstream, settling in layers. Organic material deteriorated rapidly in the water. Within weeks, even if a body somehow broke free of its weights, it would be unrecognizable and impossible to connect to any specific person. By autumn of 1883, the operation had become routine. The fleet processed approximately 2 subjects per month. Guthrie's specimens were collected by courier boats at scheduled meetings. Payment arrived in cash, usually within a week of delivery. The profits exceeded Adelaide's projections. The buyers asked no questions about the source of the specimens. Medical schools needed teaching materials and didn't scrutinize how suppliers obtained them. Private physicians conducting experimental procedures valued access to fresh organs more than ethical concerns. The black market for anatomical materials operated openly in certain circles, with suppliers and buyers maintaining a mutual understanding that discretion served everyone's interests. Guthrie expanded his customer base throughout the fall. He made contact with institutions in Nashville, New Orleans, and St. Louis. Some wanted specific organs for particular research. Others purchased whatever became available. The doctor maintained a waiting list of requests, fulfilling orders as opportunities arose. The fleet's regular business continued unchanged. Men visited for entertainment, spent money on whiskey and companionship, and departed safely. The occasional disappearance fit the established pattern that authorities had already investigated and dismissed. No new suspicions arose because nothing appeared different from the outside. But the Mississippi River bottom was accumulating evidence. Dozens of bodies lay in the sediment along the fleet's regular route. Chains that would last decades held them down. Personal effects that families might have used to identify their missing relatives rested in the mud. The river was becoming a mass grave, and everyone aboard the shanty fleet understood exactly what they had created. Dr. Guthrie's network of buyers expanded through connections he had cultivated during his legitimate medical career. Before losing his license, he had attended professional conferences, corresponded with colleagues across the South, and maintained relationships with administrators at teaching hospitals. These contacts proved invaluable when he needed to establish a supply chain for anatomical specimens. The communications occurred through coded language in letters sent to general delivery addresses. Guthrie would write to a physician in Nashville describing materials available for research purposes, with specifications about type and condition. The recipient would respond with an order and payment terms. No explicit mention of human organs appeared in the correspondence, but both parties understood perfectly what was being discussed. Medical schools faced legitimate shortages of cadavers for anatomy instruction. State laws restricted how bodies could be obtained for dissection, typically limiting sources to unclaimed paupers or executed criminals. These legal supplies fell far short of educational needs. Schools that wanted to maintain competitive anatomy programs had little choice but to purchase specimens from questionable sources. The directors of these institutions maintained careful ignorance about origin. When a shipment arrived from a supplier like Guthrie, it was logged as donated materials or purchased specimens, with no further documentation. The financial transactions occurred through intermediaries, a medical school would pay a procurement agent, who would then pay the supplier. This buffer protected the institutions from direct involvement. Private physicians presented a different market. Some were conducting experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of medical knowledge. Transplantation of organs between subjects remained largely theoretical in 1883, but ambitious surgeons were attempting to develop techniques. These experiments required fresh organs from healthy donors, and they required many of them, as most attempts failed. One such physician, Dr. Marcus Pembroke in New Orleans, became Guthrie's most consistent customer. Pembroke was attempting to develop methods for kidney transplantation, working with animal subjects, and occasionally with human tissue. He paid premium prices for kidneys harvested from young, healthy donors. His letters to Guthrie specified exact requirements. The subjects should be between 25 and 35 years old, in excellent physical condition, and the organs needed to be preserved within 2 hours of harvest. Guthrie could meet these specifications because his operation controlled the entire process. Unlike grave robbers, who worked with bodies that had been dead for unknown periods, he harvested from living subjects and preserved immediately. This freshness made his specimens particularly valuable for experimental purposes. The logistics of transport required careful planning. Preserved organs could survive several days in sealed containers, packed with ice and sawdust. The courier boats that met the fleet at predetermined locations carried these shipments to rail connections. From there, they traveled by train to buyers in Nashville, St. Louis, New Orleans, and occasionally as far as Atlanta. Payment arrived through similar networks. Buyers would transfer money to banks in Memphis or Vicksburg, where Adelaide Crowe maintained accounts under assumed names. She would withdraw cash periodically and bring it back to the fleet. The financial records of these transactions showed nothing unusual. They appeared to be ordinary business dealings between legitimate parties. By winter of 1883, the operation had generated substantial profits. Adelaide's ledgers showed income far exceeding what the fleet could have earned through traditional vice operations. She invested some of this money in improvements to the vessels, purchasing better equipment and supplies. The rest accumulated in bank accounts. Guthrie expanded his capabilities. He purchased additional surgical instruments and preservation supplies. His medical suite was upgraded with better lighting and ventilation. He acquired reference materials on anatomy and preservation techniques, constantly refining his methods to improve specimen quality. The doctor also began experimenting with more ambitious procedures. Some buyers requested complete organ systems rather than individual specimens. A university in Memphis wanted a complete digestive tract for permanent display in their medical museum. This required more extensive work and commanded a significantly higher price. The fleet's reputation in the underground medical supply network grew. Word spread discreetly among physicians who needed specimens for research or instruction. Guthrie received inquiries from as far away as Baltimore and Chicago. While he couldn't fulfill distant orders regularly due to transport limitations, he occasionally arranged special shipments for particularly lucrative contracts. The operation's success created a perverse incentive structure. Each subject processed generated several times more revenue than a week of ordinary business. The temptation to increase the frequency of selections grew stronger. Adelaide resisted this pressure, understanding that maintaining the pattern of occasional disappearances was essential to avoiding detection. But the financial rewards were enormous. The fleet had transformed from a modest criminal enterprise into something approaching an organized industry. The women aboard were earning money at levels they could never have achieved through legitimate work. Dr. Guthrie was practicing his surgical skills and conducting research without regulatory oversight. The buyers were obtaining materials they needed for advancement of medical knowledge. Everyone involved benefited except the subjects whose bodies were being dismantled and sold. Those men disappeared into the Mississippi, their organs dispersed across the South in laboratories and teaching theaters. Their families searched for answers that would never come. And the black market network that connected supplier to buyer continued operating efficiently, quietly, and profitably. The river kept flowing south, carrying away evidence and secrets. The fleet kept drifting with it, anchoring in familiar spots where new subjects could be found. And in medical institutions throughout the region, students and researchers examined specimens without ever knowing they were studying the remains of murdered men from a floating operation that existed outside the reach of law. Federal Marshal Cyrus Ramsey first heard about the Shanty Fleet disappearances in October of 1883. His cousin, Daniel Ramsey, had traveled from Kentucky to Helena, Arkansas, on business related to a timber contract. Daniel mentioned in a letter that he would stop at the floating settlement for an evening, before catching a steamboat home. That letter was the last communication his family received. Cyrus Ramsey held a position that gave him authority across state lines. Unlike county sheriffs whose jurisdiction ended at their borders, federal marshals could pursue investigations throughout their assigned territories. Ramsey's district included portions of Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi along the river corridor. The disappearance of his cousin transformed what had been scattered local cases into something that demanded his personal attention. He began by collecting every missing person report filed in connection with the fleet over the previous 2 years. This required traveling to county seats throughout the region and reviewing sheriff's records. Many of the local lawmen were cooperative once they understood Ramsey's interest. Some had suspected the fleet was involved in criminal activity, but lacked the resources or jurisdiction to investigate properly. December of 1883, Ramsey had documented 49 disappearances. The pattern was undeniable. Every missing man had visited the Shanty Fleet. Every one had been traveling alone. None had been seen again at any downstream location. The explanations provided by the women aboard the fleet were remarkably consistent, suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. Ramsey interviewed family members of the missing men. Their testimony revealed additional details that hadn't appeared in official reports. Several mentioned that their relatives had seemed unusually interested in visiting the fleet after receiving handbills or hearing descriptions from the women who distributed them. A few recalled their loved ones mentioning specific women by name who had been particularly friendly during initial visits to river towns. The marshal attempted to board the fleet on 3 separate occasions during January of 1884. Each time, Adelaide Crowe received him politely and answered his questions with practiced ease. She provided access to her business ledgers, which showed names and dates of visitors. She allowed him to speak with several of the women, who all told variations of the same story. Men came, enjoyed themselves, and left. What happened to them after they departed the fleet was beyond their knowledge or responsibility. Ramsey found no obvious evidence of wrongdoing during these visits. The vessels were clean and well-maintained. The women appeared healthy and claimed to work voluntarily. No weapons were visible. No signs of violence could be detected. The marshal's authority allowed him to inspect the fleet, but he needed probable cause to conduct a thorough search or make arrests. The lack of bodies presented the fundamental obstacle. Without physical evidence of death, Ramsey couldn't prove murder. The disappeared men might have chosen to start new lives elsewhere. They might have drowned accidentally. Any number of explanations remained theoretically possible. Suspicion, however strong, wasn't sufficient for prosecution. Ramsey began investigating from a different angle. He tracked the fleet's movements over the previous 2 years, mapping where it had anchored and when. He then overlaid this data with the dates and locations of disappearances. The correlation was striking. The fleet had been present within a day's journey of every missing man's last known location. He also examined the fleet's financial activity. Adelaide maintained accounts at banks in Memphis and Vicksburg under the name Crow River Trading Company. The deposits were substantial, far exceeding what a floating brothel should reasonably generate. Ramsey obtained bank records through court orders and discovered that income had increased significantly after the spring of 1883, exactly when his cousin had disappeared. The marshal shared his findings with other federal authorities in February of 1884. He argued that the statistical evidence justified a coordinated law enforcement action. The Justice Department reviewed his documentation and agreed that probable cause existed for a more aggressive investigation. Ramsey began coordinating with state militias in Arkansas and Mississippi. A raid on the fleet would require significant manpower. The vessels needed to be surrounded to prevent escape. Every person aboard would need to be detained and questioned. Most importantly, the fleet needed to be searched thoroughly, including areas below the waterline that had been inaccessible during his previous visits. While these preparations proceeded, Ramsey continued gathering intelligence. He interviewed riverboat captains and pilots who worked the Mississippi regularly. Several mentioned seeing the fleet meet with courier boats at odd hours. One pilot recalled observing crates being transferred from the main barge to a smaller vessel under unusual circumstances. The crate had been packed in ice, which struck him as notable since it was winter and nothing needed cooling. These details suggested the fleet was engaged in some form of commerce beyond the obvious vice operations. Ramsey couldn't determine what they were transporting, but the secrecy and unusual timing implied illegal activity. This information strengthened his case for the planned raid. By early March of 1884, everything was in position. The marshal had assembled a force of 30 men, including federal deputies and state militia volunteers. He had obtained warrants for the arrest of Adelaide Crow and authorization to search all vessels in the fleet. Intelligence indicated the fleet would be anchored near Greenville, Mississippi, during the second week of March. Ramsey understood this would be his only opportunity. If the raid failed to produce evidence, if the fleet escaped, or if his suspicions proved unfounded, his career would likely end. But he also knew that nearly 50 families were waiting for answers about their missing relatives. His own cousin was among them. Whatever was happening aboard the shanty fleet needed to be exposed. The marshal made final preparations and waited for the right moment to strike. Constance Birch had been aboard the shanty fleet for 8 months when she decided to risk everything. She was 26 years old, originally from Louisville, and had been recruited through deception that she only fully understood after it was too late to leave safely. She had worked as a seamstress in Louisville until the autumn of 1883. A woman named Margaret, well-dressed and seemingly respectable, had approached her with an offer of employment. Margaret claimed to represent a traveling entertainment company that needed someone skilled with needle and thread to maintain costumes and do alterations. The pay was generous, room and board included, and the work would involve traveling along the Mississippi, visiting various towns. Constance accepted. She needed money, and the opportunity seemed legitimate. Margaret brought her to the fleet in November, and the reality became clear immediately. This was not a costume company. The women aboard earned their living through entirely different means. Constance was expected to participate or find herself stranded in an unfamiliar town without money or resources. She adapted to survive. The fleet's isolation and the women's collective understanding that leaving meant exposure to authorities who would likely arrest them as prostitutes created an effective prison without bars. Constance learned to play her role, but she also observed everything happening around her. By late December, she had witnessed 3 procedures. The first occurred on a night when Dr. Guthrie worked in his medical suite below deck. The sounds that came from that space were impossible to ignore for anyone sleeping in the adjacent quarters. The next morning, she saw chains and canvas being prepared, saw the women dispose of something heavy over the side during the pre-dawn hours. Constance said nothing. Speaking about what she had seen would accomplish nothing except marking her as a liability. She continued her work, maintained silence, and began planning. Escape from the fleet was possible only when it anchored near towns. Even then, leaving meant being noticed. The women watched each other, not out of malice, but from shared understanding that their entire operation depended on secrecy. Her opportunity came on January 12th of 1884. The fleet anchored near Arkansas City, Arkansas, to take on supplies. Constance volunteered to go ashore with 2 other women to purchase fabric and thread. In the general store, while her companions were distracted examining goods, she slipped out the back entrance and ran. She made her way to the local sheriff's office and asked to speak with whoever had authority. The deputy on duty initially dismissed her as a prostitute seeking protection from her employer, a common enough occurrence that rarely resulted in prosecution. But Constance insisted she had information about missing men and the shanty fleet. That got his attention. Within an hour, Marshal Cyrus Ramsey received a telegraph message in Memphis. A witness had come forward. He traveled immediately to Arkansas City and interviewed Constance for 6 hours that first day. What she described exceeded his worst suspicions. Constance provided details that could only come from someone who had been present. She described the layout of the fleet's vessels, the location of Guthrie's medical suite, the preservation equipment and storage methods. She identified Adelaide Crowe by name and described her role managing the operation. She named several of the other women and explained how subjects were selected. Most critically, she could describe the disposal protocol. She had seen the canvas wrapping, the chains used as weights, and the specific locations where the fleet typically anchored when disposing of remains. She explained that the women chose deep channels where the current ran strong, places where bodies would be swept downstream and settle in sediment. Ramsey asked about Dr. Guthrie's records. Constance confirmed that the doctor kept detailed journals documenting his procedures. She had seen him writing in leather-bound books after each session, recording information about specimens and their destinations. These journals were kept locked in his cabin, but she knew they existed. The testimony about organ sales was particularly significant. Constance had overheard conversations between Guthrie and Adelaide about buyers. She could name cities where shipments were sent: Nashville, New Orleans, St. Louis. She described the courier boats that would meet the fleet to collect preserved specimens packed in ice. She provided dates when she knew procedures had occurred. 3 incidents during her time aboard could be correlated with missing person reports. One involved a man named Timothy Ketchum from Tennessee. Another was a traveler who had introduced himself as Robert from Indiana. The third she knew only as the red-headed fellow, but she remembered the approximate date in late December. Ramsey questioned her credibility. Why should he believe her testimony? Could she be a disgruntled employee inventing stories? Constance answered by describing details of the fleet's construction that she could only know from living there. She identified the specific barge where Guthrie's suite was located, described the internal layout, mentioned a modification made to the floor to facilitate drainage. More importantly, she was willing to testify in court. She understood this meant publicly identifying herself as someone who had worked in a brothel. Her reputation would be destroyed. She might face prosecution herself, but she also understood that remaining silent made her complicit in ongoing murder. Ramsey arranged for her protection. She was housed in a safe location while he finalized plans for the raid. Her testimony provided the justification he needed to obtain broader warrants and to coordinate with federal authorities at higher levels. The marshal also used information Constance provided to plan the raid's tactics. Knowing the exact location of Guthrie's medical suite meant officers could secure it immediately. Understanding the disposal protocol allowed him to arrange for divers who could search the river bottom at known anchorage points. Constance Birch's escape transformed the investigation from circumstantial evidence into actionable intelligence. Without her testimony, Ramsey might have continued collecting data for months without sufficient grounds for a raid. Her willingness to come forward, despite the personal cost, meant that the Shanty Fleet's operation would finally face exposure. The raid was scheduled for March 15th. Constance would be present, prepared to identify locations and individuals. She understood the women aboard might hate her for betraying them. She understood her life would never return to normal. But she also knew that men were being murdered, their bodies treated as raw materials, and their families left wondering what had happened. She had made her choice. Now the consequences would unfold. The raid began at 4 a.m. on March 15th, 1884. Marshal Ramsey had positioned his forces on both sides of the river near Greenville, Mississippi, where intelligence indicated the fleet had anchored the previous evening. 6 boats approached from upstream and downstream simultaneously, cutting off any possibility of escape. The women aboard the fleet were sleeping when the officers boarded. There was no resistance. Adelaide Crowe, roused from her cabin, demanded to see warrants. Ramsey produced them and ordered everyone on deck. Within 20 minutes, all 41 people aboard the fleet were detained under guard while search teams began their work. Constance Birch accompanied the officers as they moved through the vessels. She directed them to the largest barge and pointed to a hatch leading below deck. 2 deputies descended with lanterns and found exactly what she had described. The medical suite occupied a space approximately 12 feet by 20 feet. The canvas-covered walls showed stains that soap and water hadn't completely removed. A reinforced table stood in the center, its surface scarred and discolored. Along one wall, shelves held surgical instruments arranged with careful precision. Scalpels, saws, clamps, and other tools lay in neat rows. Glass preservation jars filled another shelf, most empty, but several containing specimens suspended in clear liquid. Labels on these jars indicated organ types and dates. The most recent was marked March 8th, just 1 week earlier. Dr. Guthrie's cabin yielded the journals Constance had mentioned. 5 leather-bound volumes sat in a locked trunk that officers forced open. The doctor had documented everything with scientific detachment. Each entry included a date, a brief description of the subject, details about which organs were harvested, notes on their condition, and information about buyers. The handwriting was precise and legible. Ramsey read through the most recent journal as dawn broke. The entries covered the period from April of 1883 through March of 1884. Guthrie had recorded 137 procedures during that time. Each entry represented a man who had disappeared. The doctor's notes included observations about which techniques produced the best preserved specimens and which buyers paid premium prices for specific organs. The shipping ledgers found in Adelaide Crowe's cabin corroborated Guthrie's records. She had maintained detailed accounting of specimens sent, payments received, and expenses for supplies and equipment. The financial documentation showed the operation had generated over $11,000 in the previous year, an extraordinary sum for the era. In the bilge of the main barge, officers found physical evidence that would prove crucial at trial. Chains and weights used for disposing of bodies were stored there. More significantly, they discovered human hair caught in the anchor mechanism and small bone fragments wedged between deck planks. The fleet's anchors had been dragging across the river bottom, where bodies lay weighted down. Marshal Ramsey ordered divers into the water at the fleet's current anchorage location. The Mississippi was approximately 40 feet deep at that point, with moderate current. The divers worked in shifts throughout the day. By evening, they had recovered partial skeletal remains from 3 individuals. The bones showed evidence of having been weighted down with chains. Personal effects recovered included a pocket watch engraved with the initials DR, belonging to Daniel Ramsey, the marshal's cousin. 23 people were arrested that day. Dr. Leland Guthrie was charged with multiple counts of murder. Adelaide Crowe faced identical charges plus additional counts related to operating a criminal enterprise. The other women were charged as accomplices, with varying levels of culpability based on their involvement. The prisoners were transported to Memphis for federal prosecution. News of the raid spread rapidly through river communities. Families who had filed missing person reports began arriving at the marshal's office seeking information. Ramsey's staff worked to match names from Guthrie's journals with missing person reports. The medical institutions that had purchased specimens became the subject of investigation, though prosecuting them proved difficult. The schools and private physicians claimed ignorance about the source of materials. Their records showed payments to suppliers, but included no documentation suggesting they knew the organs came from murdered subjects. Without evidence of knowing participation, authorities couldn't bring charges. The courier boat operators who had transported specimens were tracked down and questioned. Most claimed they believed they were moving legitimate medical supplies. A few admitted suspecting something improper, but said they needed the money and hadn't asked questions. Several faced charges for accessory after the fact, though convictions proved difficult to obtain. The press coverage was extensive and sensational. Newspapers throughout the South published accounts of the river murders and the floating charnel house. Reporters attended hearings in Memphis and interviewed anyone connected to the case. The gruesome details ensured sustained public interest. Constance Birch's testimony to the grand jury lasted 2 full days. She described the operation's methods, identified participants, and provided specific information about dates and victims. Her willingness to testify despite the personal cost made her a sympathetic figure to some and a traitor to others. She received death threats from parties unknown, but remained under federal protection throughout the proceedings. The grand jury returned indictments on April 3, 1884. The trial was scheduled to begin in June. The prosecution's case rested on Guthrie's journals, Adelaide's financial records, the physical evidence recovered from the fleet, the skeletal remains pulled from the river, and Constance Birch's eyewitness testimony. Defense attorneys argued that the journals could be fabrications, that the financial records showed only legitimate business income, and that Constance was a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. But the evidence was overwhelming. The journal's detail and consistency, the matching of entries to missing person reports, the physical evidence aboard the vessels, and the recovered remains created a picture that no defense could adequately challenge. As the trial date approached, additional evidence continued emerging. Dredging operations at other locations where the fleet had regularly anchored recovered more skeletal remains and personal effects. The final count suggested nearly 200 men had been murdered over the fleet's 3 years of operation. The Mississippi River, which had hidden the fleet's crimes through depth and current, was slowly yielding its secrets, and the people responsible were finally facing justice for what they had done. The trial of Adelaide Crowe, Dr. Leland Guthrie, and 21 others began on June 4, 1884, in federal court in Memphis. Judge Herman Whitlock presided over proceedings that would last 7 weeks. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, reporters, and families of the missing men. The prosecution presented its case methodically. Dr. Guthrie's journals were entered as evidence, with the lead prosecutor reading selected entries aloud. The clinical language the doctor had used made the testimony even more disturbing. He had treated human beings as raw materials, documenting their organs with the same detachment a butcher might use, describing cuts of meat. Adelaide Crowe's financial ledgers showed the business side of the operation. The prosecution demonstrated how income had increased dramatically after Guthrie joined the fleet, and how that income correlated directly with the number of disappearances. Expert witnesses testified about the value of organs on the black market, establishing that the amounts recorded in Adelaide's books matched what such specimens would command. Constance Birch took the stand on the 8th day of trial. She testified for 3 consecutive days, describing everything she had witnessed. Defense attorneys attempted to discredit her, suggesting she was complicit in the crimes and testifying only to save herself. But her consistency under cross-examination and the way her testimony aligned with physical evidence made her credible to the jury. The skeletal remains recovered from the river were presented as evidence. Forensic experts testified about how long the bones had been submerged and what the condition suggested about cause of death. Personal effects matched to missing person reports created direct connections between victims and the accused. Defense attorneys argued that the journals could have been fabricated after the fact, that the financial records proved nothing criminal, and that the skeletal remains couldn't be definitively linked to their clients. They suggested Constance Birch had invented her testimony out of spite. But the accumulation of evidence overwhelmed these arguments. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On July 23, 1884, they returned guilty verdicts for all defendants on multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. The courtroom erupted in reactions from families who had waited months or years for this moment. Sentencing occurred the following week. Judge Whitlock sentenced 8 defendants to death by hanging, including Dr. Guthrie and Adelaide Crowe. The others received prison terms ranging from 10 to 30 years, based on their level of participation. Those who could demonstrate limited involvement or cooperation with investigators received lighter sentences. The executions took place on September 12, 1884. A crowd of nearly 3,000 people gathered at the Memphis jail to witness the hangings. Dr. Leland Guthrie showed no emotion as he climbed the scaffold steps. Adelaide Crowe maintained her composure until the end. The other 6 condemned prisoners displayed varying degrees of fear and resignation. The medical institutions that had purchased organs faced no criminal prosecution, though several experienced public embarrassment. The University of Nashville closed its anatomy program temporarily after revelations that it had acquired dozens of specimens from the fleet. Private physicians who had bought organs for experimental procedures faced professional censure, but no legal consequences. Constance Birch disappeared from public record after the trial concluded. She had testified under her real name, sacrificing any chance at anonymity. Some newspapers portrayed her as courageous for coming forward. Others suggested she had been complicit until circumstances forced her to betray her accomplices. Her fate remains unknown, though some accounts suggest she moved west and assumed a new identity. Marshal Cyrus Ramsey continued his career in federal law enforcement. The successful prosecution enhanced his reputation, and he eventually received promotion to a regional supervisory position. He maintained contact with families of victims for years afterward, helping them navigate the process of officially declaring their loved ones deceased. The recovery of remains continued sporadically for over a decade. Dredging operations, flood-related erosion, and accidental discoveries by fishermen and riverboat crews turned up bone fragments and personal effects along the Mississippi between Memphis and Vicksburg. By 1895, authorities had documented evidence of at least 197 victims. The final accounting was likely higher. Dr. Guthrie's journals covered only the period from his arrival in spring of 1883 through the raid in March of 1884. Adelaide Crow's operation had been selecting victims since spring of 1881. The fleet's earlier crimes, before Guthrie's systematic documentation, left minimal records. How many men disappeared during those first 2 years remains unknown. The Mississippi River's depth and powerful current meant that most victims were never recovered. Their remains lie still in river sediment, scattered across hundreds of miles of riverbed. Sandbars shift with each flood season, periodically exposing and then reburying what the water holds. The shanty fleet itself was dismantled and burned after the trial concluded. Authorities wanted no remnant of it to survive as a curiosity or attraction. The vessels were towed to a remote location and destroyed. Nothing remains of the physical structures where nearly 200 men met their end. The case established legal precedents for federal prosecution of crimes occurring in navigable waters and for interstate criminal enterprises. It also highlighted vulnerabilities in medical supply chains that allowed organs from questionable sources to enter legitimate institutions. Some reforms followed, though comprehensive regulation of anatomical specimens wouldn't occur for decades. Families of the victims received no financial compensation. The money seized from Adelaide Crow's accounts was used to cover prosecution costs. Most relatives had only the knowledge that justice had been served and the certainty that their loved ones were dead. The Mississippi continues flowing south, carrying commerce and history. The river bottom holds secrets from every era of human activity along its banks. The men who disappeared into its depths in 1881 through 1884 are part of that hidden history. Their stories preserved now only in court records, newspaper archives, and the memories passed down through families who never stopped searching for answers. If this story disturbed you the way it should, if it made you realize how easily evil can hide in plain sight, then prove you're still human in a world that's forgotten how to feel. Hit that like button. Not for us, but because stories like this need to be remembered. Subscribe to this channel, because we're not here to make you comfortable. We're here to make you think. We're here to remind you that the darkness doesn't just exist in history books. It exists wherever people decide profit matters more than human life. Don't let these victims be forgotten. Don't scroll past like they never existed. Engage, remember, and never assume that something evil can't be happening just because it seems too monstrous to be real.